Many people believe that once they understand a new idea about consciousness or identity, their reality should begin to change immediately. But something strange often happens, even after moments of deep clarity, even after realizing that your reality reflects your identity. Your mind slowly drifts back to the same patterns it always had. The same thoughts, the same emotional reactions. The same invisible assumptions about what is possible and what is not. It can feel confusing. You begin to question yourself. If identity shapes reality, why does the mind keep returning to the old identity? The answer lies in something deeper than motivation or discipline. Your mind is not simply a collection of thoughts. It is a system of patterns. Patterns that were repeated thousands of times over years of experiences. Emotions, fears, expectations, and beliefs about who you are. Those patterns create a sense of psychological stability, and the brain is designed to protect stability, not necessarily growth. This means something very important. Your mind will often try to return to the familiar identity, even when a new identity would create a better reality. Not because the new identity is impossible, but because the old identity feels predictable. And the human mind often prefers predictable discomfort over unfamiliar transformation. Most people interpret this resistance as failure. They assume something is wrong with them, but in truth, this resistance is not a sign of weakness. It is simply the mind trying to preserve the identity it has rehearsed for years. When you begin to understand this mechanism, something important changes. You stop fighting your mind. And you begin to observe it. Because the real transformation does not begin when you force change. It begins when you see the patterns that are silently maintaining the old identity. Once those patterns become visible, something powerful happens. You begin to realize that the mind repeating an identity does not mean that identity is permanent. It only means it has been practiced longer, and what has been practiced can always be replaced. But first, we need to understand something even deeper. Why the mind holds on so tightly to the identities that limit us. The human mind learns identity through repetition, not through logic. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of personal transformation. Most people try to change their life by changing their thoughts, but thoughts alone rarely change identity. Identity is formed through patterns of emotional familiarity. Your brain becomes comfortable with certain ways of thinking, reacting, and interpreting the world. Over time, those patterns become automatic. They begin to operate in the background of your consciousness, and eventually, you stop noticing them completely. This is why identity feels so real. Because the patterns that define it are invisible. For example, imagine someone who has lived for years believing that success is difficult or reserved for others. Even if this person learns new ideas about abundance or opportunity, the deeper identity pattern may still remain active. So when opportunities appear, the mind interprets them through the old lens. Doubt appears, hesitation appears. And slowly, the old identity reasserts itself. Not because the new reality was impossible, but because the old interpretation returned. This is how identity maintains itself. It filters perception. It decides what feels realistic, and most importantly, it defines what the mind believes it deserves. This is why two people can experience the same opportunity in completely different ways. One sees possibility, other sees risk. One feels expansion. The other feels uncertainty. The external situation may be identical, but the identity interpreting it is different, and that identity shapes the reality each person experiences. This is the quiet power of identity. It does not shout. It does not demand attention. It simply repeats its patterns until they become the background of your life. But once you begin observing these patterns, something remarkable happens. You begin to notice that your thoughts are not commands. They are echoes. Echoes of the identity you have rehearsed the most. And the moment you recognize that, you begin to see that identity is not fixed. It is trained, which means something extraordinary becomes possible. You can begin training a new one. At this point, many people make an important discovery. They realize that the mind is not their enemy. It is simply repeating what it has learned. Your mind does not resist change because it wants to sabotage you. It resists change because it is trying to keep your internal world consistent. Consistency is one of the brain's deepest priorities. If you have spent years thinking of yourself in a certain way, that identity becomes familiar territory. Even if that identity limits you, even if that identity keeps you from experiencing the life you want. The mind prefers the familiar map. This is why many people experience moments of insight, but struggle to sustain transformation. Insight creates awareness. But identity is built through repetition. The mind needs time to become comfortable with a new self-concept, just as it once learned the old one. Think about it like learning a new language. At first, everything feels unnatural. You must think about each word. Each sentence requires effort. But with repetition, something changes. The new language begins to feel natural. Eventually, you stop translating. You simply speak. Identity works in a similar way. When you begin practicing a new way of seeing yourself, it may feel unfamiliar. Your mind may attempt to return to old interpretations, old doubts, old assumptions. But each time you observe those patterns, instead of automatically believing them, something powerful happens. You weaken the old identity, and you strengthen awareness. Over time, awareness becomes stronger than the pattern. And when awareness becomes stronger than the pattern, identity begins to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly. The mind starts accepting new possibilities, new interpretations. New expectations. Eventually, the identity that once felt unnatural begins to feel normal. And the old identity that once felt permanent begins to feel distant. This is the quiet process through which reality begins to change, not through force, but through the gradual evolution of identity. When identity begins to evolve, something interesting happens. Your perception of reality changes before reality itself changes. Begin noticing opportunities that once seemed invisible. Conversations feel different. Decisions feel different. Even your emotional reactions begin to shift. This is not coincidence. Your mind is beginning to interpret the world through a new identity. And interpretation is one of the most powerful forces shaping human experience. Two people can stand in the same situation, but they will not experience the same reality because their identities filter what they see. This is why transformation often feels subtle at first. Reality does not suddenly rearrange itself overnight. Instead, your perception slowly changes, and perception changes behavior. Behavior changes decisions. Decisions change outcomes. Over time, those outcomes begin to reflect the identity you are practicing. This is how reality gradually aligns with consciousness. Through magic. But through the silent architecture of identity and perception. And once you understand this, something very important becomes clear. You do not need to force reality to change. You need to become aware of the identity that is interpreting it. Because the version of you that experiences a different reality is not created by external circumstances. It is created by the identity. Observing those circumstances. So the real question is not whether reality can change. The real question is this: are you willing to observe the identity your mind keeps returning to? And more importantly, are you willing to practice a new one long enough for it to become real? Because the moment identity begins to evolve, reality has no choice but to follow.